everyone. I'm Shruti Sharma. I work in the business intelligence team at the in-room content group, and I'm also doing data science in evenings at NSS. And just a piece of additional information, I had also gone through the web dev bootcamp at NSS, and probably I don't like myself very much, so I wanted to put myself through another round, a ringer, and I'm back. But the end is in sight. We have 28 days and counting down to freedom.
You sure?
I don't know. At least getting a little bit of our life back.
There can always be a third class.
Don't give me ideas. So my midstone project, as we lovingly call it, was on Bechdel test. So I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar or have heard about it? I should do like a gender-based analysis on how many men versus women know about this, but I won't. So very roughly, it's not the greatest test to measure representation of women in a piece of fiction. So but it's very objective. It's a very immediate and very categoric. So there are three things a piece of fiction three needs or requirements that need to be met in order to pass the Bechdel test. So the first being that you have to have at least two women in that work of in a movie or play or book. The second requirement is that they need to have speaking parts. So not only do you have women like crossing the street when stuff is blowing up, they actually have talking parts. And the third criteria is that the women talk to each other about anything other than a man. So now how many of you have more than two women in their lives, or at least know them, or know of two women in their lives? My point is that you would think that if movies have anything to do with real life, which is sketchy at best, but that should not be such a big deal. If movies depict anybody's life, most movies should pass this test because it isn't asking for more. And I mean it. We could, like, two women could literally be body shaming each other and it would still pass the Bechdel test. So it makes no judgment about the content of the conversation at all. It could be extremely sexist and that movie would still pass the Bechdel test, like Legally Blonde, and there are all these like chick flicks. There are a lot of those movies that totally, absolutely ace it, and a very thought-provoking movies like Hurt Locker that make you think, and some of the other ones they don't. And I'm not saying that every movie needs to, because it should totally be driven by the story. But the fact that such a huge, let's look at the data a little bit. And this is deployed, and I'll share that link with you guys. So if you want to share it with the meetup, then you're free to explore it on your own. And I got the data from the site bechdeltest.com. So it is a user curated. User submit scores. It's curated and then put on. They have a API. It gives you a JSON object. I'm not going to comment on the cleanliness of it because we should be ready for that. It wasn't too bad though. And then I collected some IMDb data sets and Kaggle data set that had budget and revenue information for movies. And interestingly, I wanted to see how this test scores by the gender of the director. So now that information isn't freely available. It's not like it's freely available, but not in a usable manner. Like unless I'm willing to go through like 7,000 or 5,000 odd list of movies for which I have a Bechdel test score. I didn't know how to assign a gender. So apparently there definitely is a gender package in R. What it tries to do is, based on the first name and the year the person was active, it assigns a gender. And now you can pick the basal data set for it. So I think it has 3 or 4 options. I picked the US census data because it's the largest data set, and most of the movies here are American movies. And I want to preface it by saying that this isn't the best way to do it. This kind of gender prediction isn't an accurate thing, but at least it gets me the data that I'm looking for, because you'll have like Sydney Poitier, that's categorized as a female. So there is always going to be that one off, but it still gives you a more aggregate level accurate picture. So this is designed like a single page application. It has a bunch of filters which it will respond to. You can watch it by ratings, revenue generated. There's a lot of missing value for revenue and budget, but that's because there is not data available for it. And I found nothing that I found, I have to admit, is earth-shattering or I wasn't expecting, but it was still good to have that feeling of validation. For example, if you pick the gender, so the average of all the movies that I have is 55% of it pass the test. Now, if you look for female directors, there are 2 very obvious things happening. There are not enough movies by female directors. That's one. The second is 82% of these pass the Bechdel test. Then another thing is, if you look at genres, for example, I don't know, crime. What do you think? Is it going to be more or less than average? As it turns out, it's less. Surprise, surprise. So let's see if for an average, more character driven rather than plot driven, it has a higher than average Bechdel test aggregate score. But I kind of played quite a bit with it, just looking at stuff. And you can too. There are not enough documentaries, but it's... So the 2 main conclusions is that if we are talking about representation, you need more diversity in people who are actually telling the stories. And then I have actually included some of really interesting links. So there's one that is that actually talks from 538, and it talks about creating the next Bechdel test. It talks about how Bechdel test doesn't actually give you the complete picture. It's a very quick and a categoric way of coming to a score, but then they actually figure out, they take input from how many people do you have employed behind the scene, like how many women do you have it, how does it score, and then they go on to talk about how you score the content, and they've come up with like variations of Bechdel test. Then there is, and if you care about representation and any of that, I don't know, this Oscar, there was an acceptance speech by Frances McDormand, and she used the phrase inclusion riders. This is the talk where it comes from. I would encourage you to give it a listen. And this, again, I've included all of these links here at the end of this application, and I think they're very fascinating. The things that they're talking about, the dollar and cent case of exclusion of women in Hollywood. It's fascinating, and I would encourage you to explore this data on your own. Questions?
So it's a little hard for me to see back here. Did you use something like bootstrap sampling to get a sense of the spread on that average?
No, I didn't. I mean, it does if you, and I could have, but if you do, if you hover over these individual dots, it at least tells you which movie and what score. But yes, I could have done a bit of a spread. It gives you a more holistic picture of what you're looking at. But I'm going to guess that it's not going to be very homogeneous. You have like all kinds of deviations in almost every set.
What's interesting is that as the time has progressed, you see the spread has gone really worse off. So
Yep.
according to this, the movies tend to be more
Yes, across the year, this doesn't really change much. It kind of hovers around 50, 55, but that's all the changes. And you, I mean, some of it is because you don't have, there's like 4,500 movies that I have. And it's going to also depend on what people see, what they submit the scores for. So this isn't like, there's definitely a bias in what the data is. And it's a lot easier to pass, like categorically pass the test than to categorically not pass. Because like you have to know the movie really well in order to know that these two women talk, but they never actually talk about anything other than a man. But to get it off the list, it's easy enough. Like if you ask directions from another woman, you're through. You actually pass the test. So I'm not going to get into that aspect of it, but it still makes a very compelling case of.
So what was the most fascinating or surprising thing that you found? Or was it pretty much just what you expected?
So the gender of the director isn't actually like the most. It was more like, oh yeah, of course. What else did I expect? But then some of the things, like when I was looking at genres, and certain ones did better than the others, and I was trying to think about what one has versus the other. I feel like any time when it is character driven, so these could be like historicals or romances, usually those genres are more character driven than plot driven. A lot of crime, adventure things are more plot driven. So things where you don't spend enough time on the characters, you tend to go with, like you skim the surface, you go with men. Or you don't flesh out the female characters then. So that thought formulation for me was interesting. Or that was a revelation.
You said you weren't going to get into the cleanliness of the labels. As far as you said, you used the website that sort of had like aggregated scores, or whether or not it passed the test.
I mean, score for one movie is going to be either 0, 1, 2, or 3. So it's not going to be an aggregate or non-aggregate. If you have no women, you get a score of 0. If you have at least 2 women, you get 1. If they have speaking parts, you get 2. And if they talk to each other about anything under the sun other than a man, then you get a score of 3. So for one piece of art or fiction, it's not an aggregate anything. You either do or you don't.
So on that last one, to get a 3, like.
That's like passing it.
Well, I guess I mean, how is that label derived? Is it somebody who sat down and kind of poured over the script, or?
Pretty much, or watch the movie. Like these are user submitted scores.
Well, I guess that's what I was meant in the aggregate. Like, are you looking at the average score?
No.
Or?
So this is already curated by BechdelTest.com. So it's submitted by users or by people, and then they go through it, and curate it before putting it on there.
Okay.
Did you see any correlation in the revenue versus the score which is better or not?
Not really, because and there is the dollar and cent case, the article that actually talks about the thing. No, you make as much money or not money, and it has nothing to do with whether you pass the Bechdel test or not. So you might as well pass it, is what I think.
Have you been able to look at whether it's an American film or other countries?
Yes, so this data is skewed more towards American films, but there are definitely like Bollywood movies in it as well. I don't know if I can pull one out right now, but there's like Hindi movies here, there's a few Tamil movies as well, and I should have had one for the language. And it's just like everything else. It's not like Hollywood specifically is more sexist. Yeah. It's a world at large.
Thank you.
Thank you.